Happy Saturday, everybody. This is Imran Nanlawala of the Walla Way, and we got a very special program for you today. Racial injustice, fact or fiction. We're going to examine everything that's been going on in the last few weeks after the death of George Floyd, and talk about systematic racism, talk about mass incarceration, talk about all these hot topics that people like to discuss. But today we're going to be viewing or discussing them in the light of evidence, data, and statistics. And I have my good friend, my brother, Khufere, founder of Leap 72, which is a strategic innovation consultancy. He's also a co-founder of Academy M, which is a organization that focuses on empowering, training, and bettering the skills and the lives of millennials. And he's also, through an organization called SMART, did a very unique program called Black Bitcoin, and it was celebrated to release the first fully Black superhero movie, Black Panther. So SMART, in partnership with the Greater Houston Black Chamber of Commerce, had the Black Bitcoin event to empower Black business owners. Kamara, how you doing, man?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing good, man. Doing good. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining
Thanks
us,
for
man.
having
And
me
I'm
on.
I'm sorry for that lengthy introduction, but I think it's a bit warranted. Since I know the audience and I know you, I kind of am putting on my magical hat and figuring out that some people are going to be a little triggered by some of the things that we're going to discuss today and disturbed. So I wanted to start off this interview by saying that you are someone who has been vested in the African American community, not only as an African American, but someone who's given back your time, your mentorship, your entrepreneurial training, having events like the Black Bitcoin. So thank you for that. But what do you feel in terms of the fact that people are so ready to dismiss rhetoric that they don't agree with right away? So I've been keeping up with some of the Facebook comments and the conversations on Facebook you've been having with others, and it seems like people are just so quick to disagree and so quick to get triggered. So just based on that, what are your thoughts?
I think right now we're in a unique place in time because you got to put everything in context. Um, the situations that's been going on in regards to the protests, the riots, people getting very angry and seriously outspoken on Facebook. None of this stuff is really new if you look at the history of the United States. What's new is we have a technology platforms now to capture all this stuff real time versus when these things were going on in the 20s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. We didn't have the technology we did. We didn't have smartphones. We didn't have social media. We didn't have like a 24-hour news cycle, right? So now everything gets inflated real time. And since everything's inflated real time, it really doesn't give people time to really digest what they just read 2 seconds ago. They immediately get hit with either something that confirms their cognitive bias or their social beliefs, or they get hit with something that doesn't confirm their cognitive bias or social beliefs. So, and then you have to also add in, outside of us having all these technology to capture all this stuff real time, it's kind of like what Malcolm X once referred to as a power cave, right? In 1964, is that okay? All this has been building up for a very long time, right? So you had racial injustice at the local levels, the national levels, that from inception in this country, built even into the Constitution of this country, that's been boiling over, ready to explode. And at different times in history, especially throughout the 60s, I mean, I don't think we've seen anything close to what we've been seeing recently here in the United States, as far as the riots and the protests since the death of Martin Luther King in 1968. So I think you just have a perfect tidal wave of a lot of built up aggression, anger, disappointment, disenchantment with the status quo and how rights haven't been protected in the Black community. But I also think you tailor that next to the first pandemic we've had in this country in 100 years. So we have a pandemic in this country that literally we've been locked up for 30 days or 2 months, depending on which state you're in. And we've been forced to seriously contemplate and digest what we see on TV, what we see on social media. So now we're consuming more information than we usually would if we weren't locked up and we were back to business as normal. So I think all these things kind of run together, have created the climate now where it's very super sensitive, it's very outspoken, and it's very intolerant of certain perspectives that don't match their own perspective.
But I guess the question now becomes, you brought up the 60s, you brought up different things. So the first thing, I mean, we can talk about this later, is I'm happy you brought up that time era. Booker T. Washington is somebody, that I read about when I was a college student, and he's someone that has got, he obviously he lived through, I believe slavery got abolished when he was a very young individual. He was about 6, 7, or 8 years old. But he was someone that
Correct.
learned, say again?
I said correct.
Yeah, he was someone that advocated working within the system, even though the system was broken, which he admitted and everybody knew. But based on the way the system is set up, you can't always rebel or push against it too hard. Otherwise, it starts pushing back. So in his opinion, work within the system, try to fix it. And now I guess what we're seeing, and part of the reason we're having this conversation, is we've seen an emotional response. And let's be honest, not just from Black people, from a lot of people, right? So even one of the mistakes I see people making is they make this a Black issue, that Black people are revolting, Black people are looting, Black people are rioting. Yeah, Black people make up some of the demographics or some of the population of the people who are doing that, but it's a cross spectrum of people. So my question is, how do you feel that the emotional response, while it might be warranted to an extent, because it's been centuries and decades of frustration building up and injustice, do you feel that the emotional response is not only warranted, but is it the proper way to lash out and behave?
Well, first, I think we got to separate a couple of things.
Okay.
Before I can properly, answer that question, because I want to put some things in context to kind of preface my statement.
Sure.
So, in regards to Booker T. Washington, he did agree. He was working in the system. He took financial contributions from whites. A lot of what he got done was because he was able to work in the political and social economic spheres of his time, right? Far as in, the white community as well as the Black community. But his belief system and what he was trying to accomplish was fundamentally different than what most people understand today, or what Martin Luther King would probably believe at the beginning of his rise when he was doing social. He was not a big proponent technically of integration the way Martin Luther King was. They looked at integration two different ways. So Martin Luther King looked at integration originally, because I want to unpack that later, because towards the end of his death, he changed his viewpoints on certain points. But originally, when he was pushing for everything, he looked at integration as we're both equal. We need to share the same table, go to the same schools, et cetera, et cetera. Booker T. Washington didn't really believe in that part of integration. He looked at, we need to have technically integrated resources, right? Meaning that if you have a school where your people get educated and they have these academics, they have these learned scholars, et cetera, then Black people should have their own school. Right? That's why he created the Tuskegee Institute. And if you study the history of the Tuskegee Institute from inception, while he was alive, majority of the people who taught there were not white scholars, right? There were no white students at the Tuskegee Institute, right? He believed that Black people should focus on economic development, self-efficiency, and we should all develop trade skills, right? So that we would not be dependent or at the mercy of the white capitalist establishment, right? But while he was doing that, he never demonized the establishment because he knew it was necessary for Black progress, right? So I just wanted to put that in context first. So now when we get to dealing with the current issues, because this also parallels to what I'm about to say, when we get into the current issues, what we find is people, to say whether or not the people are warranted for having emotions about it. Well, they're warranted because when you bring up a Booker T. Washington, he was a leader, right? Since 1979, the Black community hasn't had any leadership in the community, right? At the same time, Marcus Garvey was pretty much starting his movement for the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was pretty much predicated on the structure of Booker T. Washington. J. Edgar Hoover was just now beginning what we will eventually call the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, in 1919, right? And he led that bureau for 50 years. So underneath his watch, they systematically, destroyed Black leadership, from Marcus Garvey to Malcolm X to MLK to Huey P. Newton and the Panthers, right? So when you don't have leadership to move you, to guide your anger, because that's what we need. We need guided anger. We need targeted aggression, right? What we don't need is reckless aggression or reckless anger or misdirection and strategy. And all that exists right now because we don't have the proper leadership. Now, we do have leaders like, people from Black Lives Matter, et cetera, and different organizations throughout the country who have tried to fill those voids. And I'm not going to disparage their activities or their work, right? Because as somebody who's done work in the community, it takes a lot to go out there and do grassroots organizing. It takes a lot. It's mentally draining. It's not very financially rewarding. It's all purpose-driven activities. So I'm not going to disparage their work. What I will say is that even though they are well-intentioned individuals, right? They are not always the most knowledgeable when it comes to putting together long-term strategy, right? So the emotional outbreaks that we've seen from the Black community in particular are really pretty much based on all of that. It's like, okay, well, we have no leadership. We're constantly getting, brutalized. We're not financially stable. Most Black people in the United States don't even have like $300-400 in their savings account, right? And there's new reports that's come out that says by 2053, the average Black median net worth will be at zero. That's the course we're headed on, right? So there's a lot of frustration that comes from that. So I think Blacks are within their right. My community is within their right to feel frustrated. But one thing I'll separate from the riots and the protests is we can't be misled by the media. 63% of, like, if you look at 63% of Minneapolis, where these protests started, is white people, right? 19% of that city makes up Black people, right? So when you look at the protests on TV, you see mostly white people looting, destroying property, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
So it's not really that Blacks are all emotionally upset about it. It's whites are too. Millennial whites in particular are very upset about it because they're sharing that pain on social media, because the millennial white generation is different from the baby boomer white generation, right? They don't have the same racial sensitivities that their parents or their grandparents had towards the problem, right? But they also don't have the knowledge towards the problem. So they're going to do what they naturally think they can do, which is they're going to lash out, right? So I think, once again, it all comes back down to leadership. There's really no youth leader for the millennial white generation, just like there's no millennial youth leader for the millennial Black generation. So when you're leaderless in society now, you're just going to act out. It's like having a child who pretty much wants to go outside, play on the playground, have fun, and then they get mistreated in the sandbox. Who are they going to go to help them get justice?
The teacher.
If they have no parents,
right.
They have no teachers, right? Who are they going to go to? They're just there. And then every time they go to that sandbox, they get mistreated. And the people who are there, like you said, like the teachers or the infrastructure that's supposed to protect them, what if the teacher pretty much just ignores them, right? Black people have been in that sandbox for over 250 years. So I think that's why the aggression is there, and that's why they have a right to the emotion. It's really just based off of, a lot of things compiling over a long period of time.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, because I was listening to a debate earlier on, and it was talking about black criminality. So the gentleman who was speaking was saying that, look, like essentially look at the symptom and look at the disease, right? So he says the disease is not crime. He says crime is a symptom. The disease is lack of a voice, lack of a presence, not a way to understand how to process your emotions and process your feelings. So that was a really interesting way of putting it, and also that brings in like the history of what the black community has faced, and maybe that's why certain symptoms are now starting to come out. And I know we had this conversation I think a week or two ago, but okay, I mean, you've basically summed it up saying that the community is leaderless. But in terms of the demographics or the makeup of the community, would you say that that has changed from the 60s till now?
I don't know. You got to clarify your question. So what do you mean by demographics as far as in the black community?
In the black community, like what has changed in the black community from the 60s and 70s, when you had, other than leadership, when you had all the civil rights movements going on, when you had strong leaders, when you had businesses booming and businesses starting up, etc. Till now, like what has changed?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No. I understand the question. Oh, well, pretty much it's a 360, right? Once again, it goes back to you bringing up Booker T. Washington. So his concept of integration was fundamentally different from Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that Martin Luther King was a part of. Martin Luther King and his cohorts just believed in integration in society. They didn't really believe or fight for integration of resources, right? And because of that, when you look at the 1964, bill that pretty much gave us civil rights, and then you look at the 1965 voting bill that gave us the rights to vote, right? It gave us equality to integrate, or in some cases, what some people may say assimilate into society, but it didn't give us any sort of protections to safeguard the economic resources and the intellectual resources we had already begun to create at that point. So what you get is what some economists and different intellectuals call brain drain, right? Brain drain. And what that term means is when you have a lot of people who are gifted, who are affluent, who are super intelligent, et cetera, the best of your society, they begin to migrate outside of your community to go take their talents to another community for economic gain, right? And you've seen this historically since 1964, their whole thing about, okay, we're going to desegregate a lunch counter. That's cool to desegregate a lunch counter. When they began to err, and we can say they erred now because we have history to look at. Right. Back then, there was no way they would be able to foresee the domino effects, right, that have transpired to this day. So I want to make that clear. I'm not criticizing them or their work. I'm just saying that now that we have the historical record, we can see the domino effects. So you went from desegregating lunch counter to say we're going to desegregate a neighborhood. Well, here's the problem with that. When you take all the very best of your people, right, and you tell them to go move to a white suburb, that creates an imbalance in your community because you took the best of your community. That means all the people who are at the lower end, whether it be economically, intellectually, morally, et cetera, are now just left back in this community with, once again, no leadership, right? No leadership, because you can ask anybody from the black community that comes from that time period, they will tell you crime in the black community, all the vices we see that grip the black community today were almost non-existent to the levels they are today back then. Not saying we didn't have drugs in the black community in the 60s, the 40s, or the 50s. We didn't have crack. We didn't have cocaine. We didn't have a lot of things. Those things came later on from different programs. But the point I'm trying to make is, even with the drugs we did have, even with devices we did have, those things remained under control because you had the best of the community that was forced to live with the worst of the community. And they wanted to keep it under control so they can have a nice place to raise their kids and grow their lives and their livelihood, right? But now if you take the best out the community, one of the biggest problems we have today in the Black community is supporting Black business. And number one problem in supporting Black business is logistical. All Black businesses are not located in the Black community that it's designed to serve. They're spread out all across different, hallmarks in society, all different places. So now when I deal with different, like you brought up the Black Chamber of Commerce, when I deal with the Black Chamber of Commerce, when I deal with any of these organizations like the Urban League, NAACP, and they talk about, hey, we want to really make sure we can funnel our people to Black businesses, it's like a ring around the rosy kind of problem because they don't understand that while they're well-intentioned for trying to direct traffic, they're not solving the main problem, which is you guys don't want to live in the Black community. Because you don't live in the Black community, right? You don't build your businesses in the Black community. You can't expect somebody who lives, like in my area, you can't expect somebody who lives in Third Ward to travel all the way to Sugar Land, which is a distance of almost 50 to 60 miles. And what if that person doesn't have their own car? What are they going to do? What if they depend on public transportation? Well, if you're an affluent person who's Black and you live in Sugar Land, you don't have to worry about those problems, obviously, because you're affluent. But if your business is in Sugar Land, you're paying Sugar Land taxes, which is going towards educating the same people that you say are oppressing. Right? So that's when we talk about fundamental changes, none of these things existed as problems back in the 60s, the 40s, or the 50s, because segregation was evil. But one thing that was a good thing about segregation is it forced Black people to stay united, right? Even if we didn't want to, we were forced to. Once that lid got removed, right? And to me, it's not coincidental. When the lid got removed, people got to remember, and I don't want to go too long on this point, but I just want to put this out there for context. When Martin Luther King fought to get civil rights bill passed, the person who was president at that time was Lyndon B. Johnson. He's a man who literally spent 10 years filibustering that bill in Congress. So from 1953 to 1963, he maintained two titles. Either he was the House Whip, right, or he was the House Speaker for the Democratic Party. And his main job was to stop civil rights from coming to the floor to be voted upon. And his main job was to stop civil rights from passing under Eisenhower, who has an amazing record on civil rights work as well, right? So, and I'm not trying to say that he was super sincere in him passing civil rights. He had his own motivation as far as Eisenhower. I'm just saying Eisenhower was trying to get the bill done in 53, right? All those people were trying to get the bill. A lot of people were trying to get the bill done like 10 years before. Right? So now when you get to 1964, right, he didn't really want to do the bill then either. Martin Luther King kept forcing his hand, right? And that's the power of strategic, agitation, right? He kept forcing the hand. But while he forced the hand and he got the hand to sign the bill, he wasn't paying attention to the other hand, because that same year, guess what he was doing? He was launching his anti-poverty programs targeted at Black people,
right,
along with poor white people. And one of the hallmark things of those programs that we now know as SNAP, right, which came out in 1965, was, hey, if you want these benefits, then you're going to have to fall into a certain criteria. And the biggest criteria that was damaging to the Black community was, if the man's in the house, your benefits are out. If the man is in the house, your benefits are out, right? And these kind of things were actually talked about on live television. If you go back to old TV shows, one of the TV shows my family likes to watch because we own the whole collection is Good Times, right? You know, and the benefits programs had very evil intentions layered on good, things that they were doing. So what that did was it created a whole lot of disability,
Disability.
stability.
This
Yeah, stability.
instability. Yeah.
It created a whole lot of problems like that in the Black community, because now if you don't have a strong family unit, how can you accurately build anything? And that's what you find today. So before 1964, right, over 75% of Black households had a father in the household. Today, presently, 73% of Black households do not have a father in the household.
Have you studied any correlations between not having a male figure or a father figure in the household and what type of effects or repercussions that has on children?
Yes, but I don't think we got time to unpack that. But I'll just say this. The research is well documented, not just from Black scholars, from white scholars, right? President Obama even spoke about it when he was in office, the importance of having a father in the home. We're talking about these, you're more or less likely to drop out of school. You're more or less likely to drop out of college. You're more or less likely to be addicted to drugs. You're more or less likely, right, to actually commit suicide in some cases. There's all different kind of case studies and things out there. I mean, the research is irrefutable, right? So if we have all this research, the question is, why don't we have social programs designed to put the father back in the home?
So let's talk about 2020 then, in terms of, now we talked about the 60s, the 70s, we talked about different bills, we talked about ways the household was broken. Would you say that 2020 presents, while we're living in in such a strange time where we had, COVID, and we had, these protests and looting, and we've had just a strange year in general, but would you say that 2020 is it's more easy to be a Black person in 2020 in America than it was to be a Black person in the 60s and the 70s and even before?
I think, yeah, in a lot of cases, this is going to be an unpopular opinion, because I know how my peers think about this particular topic. And I know I usually get vilified for saying these comments, but it is what it is. This is just facts. We cannot sit here and act like what we call oppression today is higher or equal to the oppression that our forefathers went through in the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, the 20s. It's just, it's not incalculable. It's not even comparable. It's really blasphemous to try to compare the two struggles. It's like the same debate we have right now. Who's better, LeBron or Jordan, right? Right.
That's not a debate, brother.
Yeah. But see, it's not a debate because people are going to cling to their biases based on the era they come from, right? So obviously, me and you, we grew up, we actually saw Jordan play. But a lot of people who didn't see Jordan play or don't remember Jordan playing are going to lean towards LeBron. This is what you call in psychology, it's just a bias of experience, right? We don't have a shared experience, so we're not going to have the same opinions on the same topic, right? And I think this is what also is at the root of the problem with some Black people in my community, is they never really went through segregation. So they don't understand the psychological and the mental effects and the hardships or the economic hardships faced from segregation. They only can compute or understand the oppression that they're faced with daily, that they see as oppression. Like the biggest struggle I've seen, the only legislative victory we've had, and it's not even a legislative victory in my opinion, but they count it as such, is at the state level recently in California. I think a year ago, they just passed a bill that's called the Crown Act or something, that's designed to, eradicate discrimination based on your hairstyles. And that was mostly designed to protect Black men and women, as well as children, right, from experiencing different levels of racism at school and in corporate America. Now, while I don't condone racism based on how you look, what your hairstyle is, et cetera, I have to give a hard critique to say that was a waste of resources, right? Black people are facing other areas of racism that have far more reaching consequences than something with your hair. Right? If you were to go back and ask Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells, Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, any of these pioneers, right, in the struggle for Black rights, hey, if all you had to do was cut your hair to get access to all the same resources the white man has, what do you think they would say?
There's no, I mean, yeah, obviously there's no question about that.
Yeah, they're not going to, because they're going to take those resources, and they're going to go build their own schools, their own stuff, and then they're going to wear whatever hairstyle they want.
Yeah.
Right? Once again, it goes back to a battle of ideology. Black people feel most discriminated against now because we still subscribe to the ideology of integration based on what Martin Luther King and those predecessors set up, which is we want to be looked at as you. We want eradication of color. Well, you can't say you want eradication of color while at the same time celebrating your color. You know, we can't say Black is beautiful and back to Africa and celebrate movies like Black Panther, getting in touch with our roots. That's not assimilation. So you have to choose. It's a painful choice. It's one that people think they don't have to make. They think they can have their cake and eat it too. Things are not that gray and they're not that simple, right? So when you look at, you know, what you can call white culture, they don't have these kind of internal struggles because number one, when they came here, they were allowed to explore, set up shop. And one thing they never debated about culturally was who they were, because they were afforded their own protections on that. What makes the Black community so fundamentally different, our struggle is different from any other community in this country, even different immigrants, such as, you know, even immigrant families such as yourself and everybody else, is that we were denied who we were through chattel slavery. And that's what makes this struggle so fundamentally difficult. It makes it hard and it makes it extremely incomparable to everybody else. Because when you know who you are and you have confidence in who you are, right, it makes your purpose more clear in what you need to do.
It gives you identity.
Exactly.
No, it's interesting because, you know, you brought up a good point last week when we were talking about this, and you said that literally the, you know, Black ancestors that you guys have were killed for learning how to read, right? And those were their problems, which are like legitimate, bona fide issues where if you want to just get a little bit of independence, get some of your own agency, you have to risk death, and sometimes the most gruesome forms of death. So now, you know, and again, I'm not saying I'm an advocate for one side or the other, but it's always good to bring balance to any argument or any conversation. And it's unfortunate that, you know, as you mentioned, you prefaced one of your statements with that your contemporaries will probably, you know, react strongly to this. It's just unfortunate that we live in a time where having a nuanced conversation can lead to like mudslinging and name calling, where, you know, we can be friends, and that doesn't mean we have to agree on every single point, right? Someone could have liberal view, a worldview. Someone could have a conservative worldview, but as long as you are respectful and you know how to debate and dialogue and be mindful of one another, that shouldn't be a problem. I want to share a quote that you shared on Facebook, and then I'm going to turn it back over to you. But you put up a really interesting quote from Martin Luther King, and it said, "If we are not careful, our colleges will produce a group of closed-minded, unscientific, illogical propagandists consumed with immoral acts. Be careful, brethren. Be careful, teachers."
Yeah, that's one of my favorite quotes, man. It's from the last book he wrote before he died, called Chaos or Community. Where do we go from here? And ironically, it's the book that hardly nobody reads. Right? It's the book that's not promoted because Martin Luther King, towards the end, knew he was going to die. He knew his life was going to be short. So when he wrote that book in Jamaica, he took like 6-7 months in Jamaica to kind of tune everything out and compile that book. And it's kind of almost like his last will and testament when you read the book, right? And what I love about Martin Luther King is that towards the end of his life, instead of just clinging to the ideology and, you know, the talking points he had promoted so much in the media to achieve certain legislative victories, he was very open in self-analyzing himself, his movement, and even his own organization, in talking about where they failed, right, and what they got wrong. You see what I'm saying? And that, I put that quote out there, because to put that quote into context, he was talking about the dangers, right, of becoming too left-leaning or too right-leaning, or falling into a pocket of pretty much rigid ideology, right? And that's what he feared most for the Black community, that we'll fall into this rigid ideology where we think everything's so simple, we could put it into a box and that's just it, right? So when he made that quote, it was saying that we have to be continuously vigilant in learning and exploring not just who we are, but what we can do as a community. We can't rest on our laurels. We can't simply pass civil rights and think the struggle is done. And unfortunately, that's what happened in the end, because the Black community hasn't had one legal victory since 1965 at the federal level. Even after having a Black president, right? I appreciate and admire a lot of the things Obama did. He broke down the color barrier as far as in the White House by becoming the first Black president. But unfortunately, he didn't pass one piece of legal legislation specifically designed for Black folks, or that was going to cater majorly to Black folks, because you really can't put any federal legislation out that favors one community over another.
Right.
In the 1965 bill, the Voting Rights Act, it protected women's rights as well to vote, right? Not just Black people, right? But it was really going to affect Black people the most, because we're the ones who bled for the bill, right? So I think that's a very important thing that we have to always remember. But you had another question. I don't remember what the other question was, or did you just want to discuss on that point a little bit further?
Yeah, I don't remember the other question, but I just thought that was a great quote, man. And I also think that even if he didn't intend it, I mean, it's very relevant today, where many people have even critiques of academia today, right? In terms of higher education is not offering the value it once did, or it's not worth the money that you're having to invest in. I remember when I went to college, one of the purposes that was taught to us is that you get a higher education because you want to enhance your critical thinking skills. But I feel like now, even in higher education, there's a lot of pandering. In some cases, they don't accept debate, right? It's very strong stances they take, pro or against. And if the university or if the system is for something, but you come out against it, and I hate to use these names, but like Ben Shapiro got banned from one of the campuses, and you've had different people who maybe even us, we don't agree with their ideology or agree with a lot of the things they say or their talking points. But for me, just this notion that they should be banned from going to a college campus, which is supposed to be a place of higher learning and debate and dialogue, to debate and dialogue is ridiculous.
And it's funny you bring that up, because I had the last debate I had on Facebook was about like a week ago. It wasn't on my page. It was on a friend of mine's page, who's also a colleague who I've worked with. And me and her don't have the same ideologies. She's she self-dubs herself as a liberal conservative, right? And me, I don't really subscribe to too many labels, but when people force me, I just tell them, look, I believe in Black nationalism, and I believe in common sense strategies to improving humanity overall, right? So, and for context, for those people who are not aware or who have been misinformed about what Black nationalism means, it simply means that we want self-efficacy, right? We want to be able to control the destiny of our future in the Black community, like every other nation, every other community does on a daily basis, without being dependent or manipulated by people who are not from our community. And that's all it means. And that's all I've subscribed to my entire adult life, right? But there's a lot of weird dichotomy in that, right? Because now, if I subscribe to that, my belief system gets challenged on a daily basis, because there's often Black people within the community, like you brought out, that may have different viewpoints on different strategies, different subjects that I don't agree with. And what spawned a debate on Facebook was about Candace Owens, right? So Candace Owens recently got kicked off of GoFundMe. And the colleague I'm referring to, she posted some stuff on her Facebook, pretty much, I'm not going to say celebrating, but basically agreeing with, her being removed from GoFundMe. And she was removed, what appeared to be was based off her rhetoric and her condemnation of George Floyd being considered a martyr for, civil rights or police reform. Now, while I'm not going to get into what her exact comments were, because honestly, I don't know what her exact comments were, because I never really watched her videos. I just saw a lot of the chitter chatter back and forth on Facebook. What I saw to me was dangerous, right? Because regardless of what she said about George Floyd, she started, from what I understood, she started that campaign on GoFundMe to help some business in Alabama that was going out of business due to the pandemic and other issues, right? But she kind of went overboard and started talking about these social issues. Now, regardless of whether that's the case or not, she goes overboard. We have something called the Fifth Amendment in the United States, which affords us free speech. And what I put on the Facebook was, free speech simply means free speech, but it doesn't mean you have to agree with the speech. Right? Let's not forget, the whole reason why we have America in the first place is because the British Crown and the monarchy wanted to determine what was considered liberal and what were your rights and what weren't your rights. People who founded this country, the founding fathers, founded this country with that Fifth Amendment right because they weren't allowed to criticize the monarchy. They weren't allowed to speak their mind. They were told what they could say and how they could think, right? And while it's easier for me to dislike Candace Owens because of her political affiliations that are pretty much tied to sustaining the same infrastructure that's disfranchising Black business owners, I have to separate that bias in the interest of the principle that allows me to achieve liberty for myself, for my family, and also for my community. Absolutely. Because without the principle and institutional right of free speech, we would have never won, right, any kind of legislative victories for the Black community here in the United States.
Yeah, and for me, that's the part that's the most frustrating, is because I think collectively we forget our collective history, how the country was founded, why it was founded, how different immigrant groups were allowed to come here and flourish. And in times in history, very contentious debates on people's freedom, people's rights. And now we're denying a very fundamental right to people that we may disagree with without examining our own biases, right? So again, I'm a little flabbergasted every time I see people who are calling for certain individuals to be deplatformed or removed from social media. And maybe there are times where that is justified, but I just find it counterproductive, especially when we talk about the topics like what you're talking about, what I'm talking about, which is, you brought up Black nationalism and whatnot. It's like you said, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? You have to have. I mean, seriously, you have to have a balanced approach, man. And what's wrong with debating and dialoguing and disagreeing with people? Where did we become so sensitive where we don't even like to engage in debates? I mean, we've had debates on the phone. We've disagreed with things on the phone. Yeah, but what's wrong with that? That's two friends, two brothers. There's free education classes in session, right? So, there's nothing wrong with that, man. So, but you can comment on that if you want, but I also want you to kind of unpack the whole Black nationalism thing. You did clarify what you meant, but I think for some people, when they hear that, they're automatically going to get a little scared. Like, okay, when you say Black nationalism, are you talking about seceding? Are you talking about making your own part of the country? Are you talking about? But I mean, you gave your definition, but I want you to expound more on that. And I think you talked about like self-determination and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, like I want to keep this simple because there's a lot of different, like in any kind of belief system, there's different versions of it. Right. So let me first start by clarifying that. So you may meet somebody who says they're a Black nationalist who believes in creating a separate state within the United States. You may meet people who say they want to repatriate Black people to Africa, right? You're going to get different thoughts. But what I try my best to do, and I say my best because sometimes, like all human beings, we may fall short in certain instances, no matter how sincere our intentions are, is I try to stick to the foundational principles of what I believe, right? And not just what I believe, but of what the ideology says. So if you go back to the beginning of the ideology, the forefathers of Black nationalism in the United States were Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey, along with, you can count Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois. I like to pronounce his name correctly as it's pronounced. Everybody knows him as Du Bois, but everybody knows him as Du Bois, but it's actually pronounced Du Bois. So if you look at those three people, and even with his talented Tim theory, Du Bois still believed in self-determination in his intellectual development. Now, towards the end of his career, that's a different story. But the founding fathers really are just two men, right? Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey. And what they wanted was for Black people to own and control their neighborhoods. Now, Garvey added an element saying that we should just leave the United States, repatriate to Africa, and consolidate our power and our resources there. So that took it from being a Black nationalist to saying I'm a Pan-Africanist, and Pan-Africanism is kind of like the father of Black nationalism, right? It's saying that all African peoples, no matter where you are in the world, should pool their resources and be self-determined and work collectively for the advancement of all African peoples, right? Whereas Black nationalism is a little bit more localized as far as theoretically. And that's what Booker T. Washington pioneered. Booker T. Washington had no interest in going back to Africa, right? That wasn't his goal. His goal was, look, we're here. This is our home. We helped fight and die and build this country. So we're going to flourish in this country. And we're going to flourish by building our own neighborhoods, our own communities, our own schools, and we can even have our own police departments if we actually build up and found towns. He actually talks about this in one of his greatest books that is hard to find, which is called The Negro in Business, right? That was published around 1909 or 1910, somewhere around there, right? And he gives examples of different businessmen of that era who have fought against racial discrimination to build these large, profitable, strong Black businesses in the Jim Crow South and through different quarters of the United States. So in all these examples he was giving was Black people were not trying to take anything away from white people, right? We're only trying to get the same thing that white people have, which is they found a way to build enterprises, to build economic infrastructure, to secure their families and to educate their families. And that's all Black people want for themselves. We don't want to strip anything else from somebody else. Now, you do have some Black people who subscribe to the reparations movement who are nationalists. And without going too deep into that, I'll just give you my take on that real quick. If we have time.
We got
which
time.
Is when you talk about the reparations, this is going to be unpopular, but it must be said. Reparations can be had. It should be had, but it should not be had for slavery. And that's a tough critique. I know any Black person watching this is probably ready to throw their shoe at the screen, right? Et cetera, et cetera. But first, before you condemn me, hear me out, right? Slavery is what is and was, as you still have some parts of the world today, right? An economic system, right? Now, within that economic system, you can have prejudice. Obviously, if you target a certain group of people because they're weak or you think they're easy to enslave, that is a form of prejudice. And that is what happened with Black people across the world, right? Now, here's the hitch. When you talk about getting justice here in the United States, as far as reparations, there is a legal recourse that must be followed based on the laws. And this is important for us to remember, because Malcolm X, one of the most respected Black nationalists, one of the most intellectual and well-traveled Black leaders of our time, said very clearly, you must take everything that the white man uses and use it against him. Right? You must take everything the white man uses and use it against him. Right? So what he meant by that is there are laws on the books that can be exploited. So now with that being understood, there has never been a case of reparations that have successfully been tried in the United States, Great Britain, or anywhere else in the world that involved slavery. And the reason why is because when you're a slave, you are property. Property, as a piece of property, you have no rights.
Right.
Only way you can get reparations if your human rights were infringed upon. Now, I know what my brothers and sisters from the Black community are going to say, well, our human rights were infringed upon because no human being should be a slave. Well, here are the hard facts, and this is something that we have to stare in the face. Most Black nationalists I've talked to, most people who are not Black nationalists I've talked to, believe that Black people built the pyramids that stand in Egypt. Question is, did we build them with slave labor? Because I don't see a whole bunch of people volunteering to build those pyramids. Right? And there are some people who are not part of the Black nationalist faction who believe they go by, Israelites, right? Some people believe they're Black Hebrews, et cetera, et cetera. They believe that they're original Jews, right? Et cetera, which basically means you were part of a slave labor force if you believe you're the original Jew that was in the Bible, right? What I'm trying to say is, in the best way I can, is in Africa, there was a precedent for slavery. The only thing white people did that made it the most corrosive, ugliest thing known to human beings in the world presently today, as far as American white people, as well as the British, what they did was they took it a step above what we knew slavery at that time.
Right.
Because you could be a slave anywhere in the world and still have your identity, right? Still have your language. What white people did here in the United States with chattel slavery is they reduced you to a beast of burden, where you didn't have a language, you didn't have a home, you basically weren't human. You were just like a horse. You were a beast of burden. That form of slavery, until the Atlantic slave trade, never existed, right? And the reason why it changed is because they had an economic incentive to make it change right here in the United States. All of this still is not going to get us reparations, because no matter how valid their system was, legally, you're never going to get it past the court. You ain't going to get it past the UN. So how do you get it passed? You get it passed by doing what the Jews did. When you look at the Nuremberg trials and everything else, Germany has received billions and billions of fines and everything else known to man since after World War II. They were ordered to pay reparations to what was then becoming and being formed the Israeli nation, the nation of Israel that we have over there in the Middle East now, right? And they've paid literally billions of dollars annually in restitution for the Holocaust. Now, how is that possible? Now, here's the thing that's the benefit of history, where we as Black people and marginalized people who are not just Black, but just people of color, we need to understand how to use our resources. So Hitler left the door open for reparations when he copied the Black codes and the Jim Crow laws of the United States, because the laws he passed during the end part of his term through 1935 to 1942 to disenfranchise the Jews, strip them of their property, right, take their liberties and put them in internment camps, were literally based off of the laws we had here in the States that were being perpetuated against Black people in the South. Right? Now, when he did that, he opened up the door for reparations once they lost the war. That's why they were able to get it, because the Jews were not property. They got property taken away from them. They got their human rights taken away from them, right? Now let's flash forward to the present. So when we say we want reparations, we shouldn't say we want reparations for slavery, because we're not going to win that way. So if you're really serious, committed about getting reparations and getting justice, then we need to say we want transitional justice, which is the legal term that's needed to start the process to get reparations. That's the same term the Jews use, the Native Americans use, even the Japanese that were put in internment camps during World War II that were suspected of sedition used the same legal measures, right? And if the Jews can use the Jim Crow laws, or use the version of the Jim Crow laws pretty much that was in Germany, to achieve reparations for their people, then why can't we use the Jim Crow laws that are literally well documented and irrefutable? There's too much documentation on how the Jim Crow laws stripped Black people of property, wrongfully prevented us from economically rising in our own communities and outside of our own communities, and literally took away our human rights and dignity for a period of 75 years. So why can't we go ahead and use those same laws, right? So to get back to my point, when we talk about nationalism, most Black nationalists are not going to subscribe to what I just said, because their emotion and their hatred of the slavery system is guiding their decisions on strategy and outcomes. Me personally, as much as I hate what my ancestors went through here in the United States and even back home in Jamaica, because my father's Jamaican, but my mom's Black American. So I look at things from two different perspectives, right? So colonial slavery and chattel slavery were two different things. But at the end of the day, when I look at, okay, how do we move forward? If we want reparations, how do we achieve it? Right? Then we have to achieve it through the same legal recourses as everybody else has achieved it. We can't simply try to break the paradigm and say, okay, we're gonna force them to pay us for slavery. Because now, even if you do win that, how do you determine who's a recipient? Right? Black people, because we were property, you can't trace your lineage. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The white people back then knew exactly what they were doing by reducing us to property. Right? You know?
That was going to be one of my questions earlier when you were talking about chattel slavery, is that, do you think, because you said that this was the worst form of history, I think part of it was because it was capitalized and, also a new era of slavery, but was this a byproduct of needing more slaves because they saw that it was economically fruitful for them here in the country? Or do you think it was intentionally done to strip the slaves from their culture, their language, their religions, etc.?
That's a great question. One of the most definitive books that's ever been written by a Black scholar on this particular subject is called Capitalism and Slavery, right? And it's by a scholar, a Trinidadian scholar named Eric C. Williams. And in his work, which came out during the late 1800s, right? So this is a very early definitive work. And it started this whole discourse on capitalism and the links to slavery, right? In his book, he pretty much proved irrefutably that the whole motive for slavery was to increase the viability for profits long term, right? They needed to build an infrastructure in America. And make this clear, they weren't innovating this structure. They were copying it from the British, right? Because the British was like, okay, we're going to set up these colonies and we're going to produce, et cetera, sugarcane, tobacco, et cetera. Originally, they didn't try bringing the Africans to these lands. Originally, the concept was to get, poor white people to go farm the lands. But what they figured out was poor white people didn't want to farm the lands and be paid wages to farm the lands, right? That's an important point, right? So when we look at America, when we look at British colonies and all of them, poor white people didn't want to be indentured servants. They didn't want to get paid to farm lands. They didn't want what we fight for today, which is jobs. They wanted their own, they wanted to be independent entrepreneurs, right? So they can get of their people to come do it. And they couldn't enslave their own people, right? Otherwise, they'll have anarchy. So they went and did the next best thing, which is, okay, we're going to go to this continent where these people are not technologically evolved the way we are. And we're going to trade people for muskets, bullion, booze, et cetera, et cetera. And that's pretty much what happened. So it was 100% what you can call capitalism in its early form, just looking to find a way to build economic infrastructure in the most profitable and most efficient way possible.
I have to ask you a question. And I know you don't intend it this way, but I had a guest on last week as well, and he said something like white folk create all the problems, and then he specified what he meant. And I know that when we generalize against the black community, the black community they're not all the same, right? Like you mentioned yourself, you have Pan-African, how did you say it?
Pan-Africanism.
Pan-Africanism. You have different levels of black nationalism. You have black liberals, black conservatives. So we don't want to make the black community seem like they're one community and they all have the same ideals, the same agenda, the same desires. So similarly, when we talk, and I know you don't mean this, but when we talk about the white community and we say the whites, unpack that for us in terms of historically, what do we mean when we say the whites? What do we mean when we say the whites today? Because I have some white friends, and I know one of the things that they always say is like, well, when you guys say whites, you're talking about me? Like I don't believe in this, or I don't do X, Y, Z. So if you can just kind of unpack that for us.
No, that's a fair point. And that's something that needs to be talked about often, because everybody who is white usually gets lumped up in this term, the whites, right? But there's a reason for that. And the reason is, even obviously the people who are living today aren't the people who perpetuated slavery. Right. There's nobody who's pretty much immortal. Okay. So obviously you didn't create the system. You didn't, most of the people today weren't alive during Jim Crow era, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the hitch. Here's the issue. Your prosperity, which you don't look at as prosperity because you're used to it. It's not a new normal for you. It is just normal, right? The fact that only 30% or 40% of white American families don't have a father in the household speaks volumes, right? So your economic and social stability is pretty much built on the back of what your ancestors did. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, it's not directly to indict you. It's more so to inform you that your ancestors left you holding a debt, right? That must be paid, right? And it's no different than if you have a family member that dies who doesn't pay their debts, what happens? So if I die and I have a whole bunch of debts, I'm married to my wife. What is the legal recourse that happens? What do the debtors do once one person dies? They come back to the other person who's a living family member and say, hey, your family member owed this debt, right? This is the system of credit and debt that your ancestors created. So under that same ideology and belief system, we as black people feel like you still owe the debt, right? Now, where I'm different than probably most black leaders, scholars, or just laymen that are in my community is I'm not of the belief that white people of today should pay directly for all the sins that their ancestors committed. What I believe is that white people today should not get in the way of black people when we try to be self-determined. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I'm not going to ask you to give up your property. I'm not going to ask you to give me 10% of your wages annually to equal the balance or whatever the case is. I don't want anything you have, right? I don't care about your particular lifestyle. I don't want you in my way, right? So that means when we set up black businesses, when we set up black districts, when we set up different things, don't get in our way just to keep your lifestyle happy. What I mean by that is, like case in point, black people across the United States have been seeing in large numbers, their neighborhoods have been gentrified by white developers coming in to buy their houses, their land, their property at rock bottom prices due to the devaluation of their homes and their land. And then these people come in and they increase the evaluation of the homes and land. And what you get is a black exodus. These people end up in apartments, they end up in different areas, et cetera, and they're still poor, while the white people who bought their lands, their property, become more rich, right? That's not a fair trade-off, right? So I proposed actually 2 years ago, if white people want to gentrify a black neighborhood, then fine, we'll leave and we'll take that little sum that you're going to give us up front, but you need to give us annual restitution. So that means any wealth you're generating in that community that's now all white or that's so affluent, forget the color, just the fact that it's affluent and and you're able to make that money because we gave up our property, you should be paying us a stipend every year, right? So that way we can go back to increasing the dollar value of our neighborhood and our community. To me, that's fair. But see, now when you talk to white people of this generation, they don't want to do that. They're like, no, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They don't want to do that, right? They'll get in the way of that. And this is not just for white conservatives, because white people today seem to lump themselves as either being conservative or being liberal, right? And as you brought out, there are a lot of different factions in every community. But here's the problem with what I see as a black person, as a black man, is that whether I'm talking to a white conservative or a liberal, they still enjoy getting in black people's way. And I'll give you an example. Everybody already pretty much knows about what people consider, white conservatives as far as what they do institutionally to black people to keep themselves at the top of the food chain. So I'm not going to go into those discussions or what those belief systems are, because most black people already know. And the ones who don't can get an idea by just Googling it, right? What I'm going to talk about, which never gets shined upon, is the white liberal, because this is the person who always says they're on our side, that they're on everybody's side, not just black people, but all immigrants and different peoples of color side, et cetera, et cetera. Well, here's the problem. If we even use the recent events of the Minneapolis riots and protests, there's approximately 9,000 to 10,000 black-owned minority businesses in Minneapolis, right? There are 33,000 white businesses in Minneapolis. When you tore up all that property and you said you were trying to get justice for Floyd, I think it's ironic that none of y'all actually set up to protect any of those minority businesses that you said you were trying to get justice for, right? But you're here for justice, right? But you destroyed a lot of property. You destroyed and you looted a lot of black-owned businesses along with white businesses. So why didn't you spare the black-owned businesses if you're really for the black people's cause? It's because you're not really here for our cause. You're only here for your own cause.
They're probably just anarchists, man. They're probably just people out there causing chaos. Yeah.
Sometimes it's anarchy. Sometimes it's just they have their own agenda. I'll give you an example. Back in the 70s, the Black Panther Party held rallies with the Students for a Democratic Society. I don't know if you're aware of that organization, but it was very prominent through the late 60s and the early 70s, right? And I always found it striking every time I researched that time period, that every time the Panthers held rallies with these people and the police would show up, that the Black Panthers would bear the brunt of all the arrests, all the fines, and they'll do all the jail time, where almost all the leaders for the Students for the Democratic Society will slaps on the wrist, right? And most of them wouldn't campaign to get any of the Panthers out of jail. Only a handful of them would. Okay. So what was really the point of joining forces with you? If you say you're for our cause, then fight for our cause wholeheartedly. There were whites who marched with Martin Luther King who gave their lives. One of them was James Reeb, however you pronounce his name, who was a priest from Boston who died right during the march organizing efforts in Selma, right? So he's somebody that I can say, okay, this person legitimately believes in our cause, right? He legitimately believes in fighting oppression, racism, etc. But you can't say you're against Black racism, et cetera, and then in the case of Minneapolis, You go tear up black businesses, black property. And then if we don't even look at that situation, let's go back to February, right? When we saw the death of a NBA legend, Kobe Bryant, right? Everybody was shocked. Everybody's dismayed. I find it very funny, but as well as cruel and ironic that in the moment of such despair, there was a faction of so-called white liberals on Twitter who thought it was important to bring up the fact that he was a rapist or a acquitted rapist or accused of being a rapist, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And this is a man who went on trial, who was judged by a jury of his peers and who was found not guilty by a jury of his peers. And pretty much he was acquitted of those charges, right? But they felt in that moment, it was important for everybody to know he shouldn't be celebrated because he was a rapist. He was a black rapist, right? So it sounds to me that you still have the same attitude that you had towards Emmett Till 60, 70 years ago, that all black men, if they get accused of rape, must be guilty, right? And this is coming from white liberals. It's not coming from white conservatives. So everybody has their own agenda. Black nationalism simply says, let us have our own agenda and just stay out of our way.
I'm gonna get you two more questions and then we can wrap up. So one question is, where do you feel ethnic minority groups that have come into this country in droves, such as Southeast Asians, more Eastern Asians, different Europeans, different Hispanics, different even African communities, where do you feel do you feel they've worked well with the African American community? Do you feel that they've taken advantage of all these ancestors that have come from the African American community that have paved the way for civil rights and have basically earned the stripes for the rest of us? Do you feel like we've learned from you guys, what we've worked well with you guys, and if not, how can we work better with the African American community?
I would. It's a hard question to answer, but just to be fair, I think we've had a lot of great examples of effective partnership, but then we've had a lot of great examples of things that weren't really that beneficial for Black people, right? And not all partnerships are going to work. So when we talk about Latinos or like the community that you subscribe to, Indo-Pac, Arabs, et cetera, there's different examples of people being helpful. Once again, I think the biggest problem has been, at least in our part, from our vantage point, and I only can speak in my experience of these things, so I can't speak for anybody else's experience in the United States. But from what I've seen from the Latinos, Indo-Pacs, the Arabs, the Chinese, etc., different people who've come in and tried to work with the Black community, is I see the same problem I usually see with white liberals, with white conservatives. They have an agenda that they want to fulfill. Once their agenda is fulfilled, they don't really care if the Black agenda gets fulfilled in the progress. And I say that not to disrespect anybody's work on the ground. There are some people who genuinely do care, but those people get overshadowed by their peers who don't, right? So, I wrote about this recently on Facebook, where I challenged some of the non-Black Muslim leaders in my community here in Houston, Texas, right, to actually speak against their own tribal communities, to tell them to remove the liquor and the lottery scratch-offs from their stores in the Black community that they profit so much off of, right? Some people liked my post, some people didn't like my post. But the fact of the post is, this is a reality that, we as Muslims, we're not supposed to consume liquor, trade in liquor, or sell liquor. We're not supposed to own casinos, casino machines, right? Things that solicit people to gamble. These are things that the Quran explicitly forbids. Yet we go and we do these things in the Black community to people who are not Muslim. And we take that money and I'm not even going to say we, because I personally don't do it, but the faction of Muslims who do it with no hesitation, and they have no guilt, right? So that's something that has to be addressed. And it's the same thing even what China's doing over in Africa, right? China currently is buying up Africa for cents on the dollar,
Mm-hmm.
Like Akon is, I'll give you an example of Akon. Akon is one of the most recognizable figures these days because of what he's doing with his Light Up Africa project to bring electricity to the continent. But that wouldn't be needed if the United States and other countries who've given over $1 trillion in aid in the last 55 years weren't deflating the currency of all the independent African nations while saddling them with debt. We could create our own energy grids and we can do our own projects. So, like I said, a lot of these things, it all comes down to, do you want to be fair? In regards to other communities such as Latinos in this country come in on different waves, right? So it's kind of hard to target, but I will say this. For the Latino communities that I disagree with are the ones that come from countries where Black people or Afro-Latins are actually disenfranchised in those countries. And then they come over here and, like you said, they'll partner with the Black community and talk about civil rights, immigration rights, but Black people in your own home country have no rights. Afro-Latins in your own home country have no rights. You see this situation bear out in Mexico as well as Chile, right? These are two places where up until recently, Black people weren't even counted in the national census of Mexico. They just got counted in the national census of Mexico last year. So you blatantly ignored Black people even existed in your country. And in all the places in Mexico, Black people live in the worst places in Mexico that are Afro-Mexican. Most of them don't even have good sanitation in the areas they live in. It's like they live in places in third world countries that have no development whatsoever. So these are the things that kind of undercut the sincerity of partnership, right? But with all that said, there are people who have stepped forward throughout history in the United States who stand shoulder to shoulder with Black people who had a ton of sincerity. Like you look at the Young Lords, who was a fringe group of revolutionaries and activists during the 60s. They were mostly of Puerto Rican descent. They stood shoulder to shoulder with the Black Panthers throughout the Midwest and a lot of their rallies. They took the same blows the Panthers did, and they fought for justice shoulder to shoulder and took all the same hardships the Panthers did in their communities in Chicago and different places in the Midwest. Right. So they proved they weren't just there for their own agenda. They were there for liberation of all peoples, period. And for those groups who make that commitment, I think there's a bright future for them working with the Black community. For those groups who don't sincerely make that commitment, I don't see a long-term future for them.
Yeah, I mean, we can make that question and that answer into a whole different series in itself. I think, which I'm going to forego for now because I don't want it to turn into something longer. But I do definitely want to bring up something to kind of end the show, which might be a little controversial depending on the guests that are watching. But it's a quote that you put up, and we'll finish it off with that because, again, I feel that we started off this conversation talking about, what's been going around in the news the last couple of weeks following the death of George Floyd, the riots, the looting, protesting, and all three of those things are not the same, right? Peaceful protesting is not the same thing as looting, right, or rioting. Mm-hmm. But you had a real interesting back and forth with some people on Facebook, man, and you have a way of kind of summarizing things and kind of highlighting in any situation what are like the important things to remember. So in regards to the looting, so can you mind if I read it real quick?
No, go ahead, man.
So you said, okay, and I quote, in Atlanta and Minneapolis, you all destroyed a bunch of Targets and other retail establishments without prejudice. Black-owned businesses and white-owned businesses, along with Jewish-owned businesses, and everyone else were looted and damaged. Now, less than 2 weeks later, after looting these stores, you're now demanding they stock Black products on the shelves. But how is that going to happen when you broke the shelves and burned down the building? So someone responded by saying they got insurance and a bunch of money they can build back up. And then you said, I honestly paused for a moment to really let that sink in. And what is being said, in the last 10 days, riots have to destroy billions in property and looters made off with millions of dollars on goods, and to believe insurance is going to pay for it all doesn't seem to make sense when in the same said breath, I have seen calls to refund and disband the police. And if there's no police, then there will be no police reports. And if there's no police reports, how can a business, large or small, file a claim with the insurance adjusters for equal value for their losses.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a very simple equation for those people who have even a basic understanding of economics. And if you sincerely believe in systemic racism, it should be very easy to understand too, right? So if you're a black business owner, most black business owners don't have the money to insure their businesses, believe it or not, right? So a lot of them are not going to be able to go to an insurance adjuster and get a dollar for dollar value for what's been destroyed, what's been lost. But let's just deal with the ones who do, right? So whether you're a black business owner, like I said, a Jewish business owner, et cetera, point is you had nothing to do with Floyd's death, right? You're just there exercising your free right of free enterprise in the United States, which you're afforded the right to do. So if you believe in systemic racism, though, because that's what blacks who were at these protests, some of them who participated in the riots, along with certain whites who participated in the riots. If you believe in systemic racism, you really believe that, then why are you putting that black business owner in the position to go to a white-owned insurance adjuster to get equal value for what you destroyed?
Possibly even get rejected, to have his claim rejected.
It's not even a possibility. It's more of a likelihood, because people have to understand the business of the insurance company is very simple. They want to charge you a monthly premium with the whole goal of never having to pay for anything. That's how they stay profitable, right? One of the largest insurance companies in the country is owned by Warren Buffett, Geico, right? And he literally has built his entire investment empire by reallocating the profits from Geico to buy stocks in Coca-Cola, Apple, and everything else known to man, right? And those profits get paid by them denying claims, And to your point, which I made in the post, so if you defund the police, or you shut down the police, or you limit the amount of officers on the street who can actually do their job effectively, right? No police report, no claim. It's a very simple equation. The insurance company's going to use whatever they have at their advantage not to pay the claim, right? So it seems to me that a lot of the people, because they were emotional at the moment, they didn't think about any of these things. And this goes back to what we talked about earlier in the discussion, lack of leadership, right? Lack of leadership. So since you have nobody who knows how to direct this anger, this aggression, this agitation, what you get is you get a lot of recklessness. And in recklessness, you're actually supporting your own oppression.
What's interesting is I think it's a way of life, right? Whether you're a person of faith or not, you find that there's always calls to remain tranquil. Like now you see a big call for mindfulness and meditation. And even when you get the moments of anxiety, learning how to kind of stabilize your heartbeat and your breath. And there's studies that show that when you're emotionally unstable or something's got you angry or flustered, you tend to make poorer decisions. So it's interesting, and you tie it to leadership, which I agree with, that it's definitely a lack of leadership in all communities where people are teaching the young generation on how to behave and how to act. But I mean, we've seen it, man. We've seen, like Killer Mike came out a couple of weeks ago and he talked about what was going on in Atlanta, mentioning that Atlanta has had several black mayors, black police chiefs, so many black-owned businesses, and you're burning down. And we're generalizing, right? So again, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm not even going to say it's a majority of black folk who are doing these things. It's a mixed bag. It's different people who are doing these things. But right now, the onus and the impetus has to be on the black community receiving this information, because either you are complaining about injustice or people are complaining about you, saying that you don't have your own agency or you're not pulling yourself out of this situation, right? So I put more onus on. I always put more onus on minorities like myself, because we have to. I mean, I do believe we have to work a little harder sometimes, depending on what our situation is and depending on what the situation is. And I think that I'm fine with that. But the calming one's emotions is very important, I believe. And now with the whole looting and rioting, black businesses being destroyed, black economics being destroyed, and even with the insurance thing, the amazing thing about insurance is if they approve your claim, say they approve more claims this year than they have in the previous years, what's the next thing that's going to happen? Insurance rates are going to go up, right? Yep. So now this is another economic burden that you're going to have to live with. Insurance is even more expensive. So I just found that post to be on point, man. I thought it was very accurate, and I think Again, we talked about a lot of things. We got to go back to the critical thinking skills. We got to go back to holistic education, not just education within four walls, but more comprehensive and holistic education. I think we need to be able to debate and dialogue with one another, to learn from one another and see what does agency mean for any group, right? Because what you define as agency for Black folk is not what I define as agency for Indian folk, or however I just,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I appreciate it, man. I'm gonna give you the final word, brother, to close us off, and I'd like for you to, in your final word, talk about some advice, because people again are very quick to misconstrue what is being said, and
Yeah.
knowing you, you are not, you are. So let me preface this: you are not a revolutionary in the sense, you're not someone who's calling for chaos and disorder. You're someone who is an economist. You're someone who's a futurist. You're someone who is an innovator. You believe in technology. You believe in good capitalism, as far as I can tell. And you're someone who believes in economic prosperity for all people. So talk to us about how we can all live together, work with one another, and make the world, I know it sounds very cliche, but make the world a better place. And I'm saying that because I know of the different things that you've done and some of the
Yeah.
things that we've done together.
Yeah. And thanks for those compliments, by the way. I think it all comes back down to what you just alluded to, right? It's not as something simple as education, right? It's simple as something as experiencing uh, experiencing each other's realities, right? And because there's tons of books out there on these subjects, but we have to bear witness to a fact. We're in an age now where people don't want to read anything, right? And they're not going to read anything. Okay. There's a select few who are, but majority of people are just not going to have the attention span to complete even a 200-page book on any subject, even if they're interested in it, right? So what this now falls into is for us having these cultural exchanges, kind of like what we're having now on your podcast, where we actually share and learn from each other's experiences. But we have to come in there as open slates. We can't come in there in attack mode, right? That's something I've had to learn hard throughout my history. When I was younger, a lot of things that people are doing now, as far as rioting, protesting, I was never a rioter, but I've done tons of protests, right? Back in the early 2000s and the late 90s, I have a record with that. And when I was younger, I felt the same kind of aggression. I still feel aggression, but now because I'm older and wiser, I understand how to best move with that aggression. And if we're going to be aggressive, let's be aggressive in the right direction. And I think it all comes from effective communication, right? But it also comes from people accepting facts, right? Which is hard because we're in a culture right now where in headline culture, a lot of facts are really not facts, they're opinions, right? So how do you measure what's fact from fiction? And we have to do that with numbers. Numbers are arbitrary. They can't be argued, right? So, and I don't go too long on this, but I'll give you two examples, right? Where people who had aggression or people who wanted to fight against injustice, racial injustice, they use strategy and they use arbitrary methods to achieve victory. So the first example I will show will go back to the Panther 21 trial. And with the Panther 21 trial in the 70s, where you had 21 Panthers in New York City who were charged with conspiracy and everything else known to man, in order to shut down the growth and survival programs, everything else, good things that the Panthers were doing at the time, right? They were able to beat over 150 different charges, 150 different charges with $2, $3, $4 million worth of legal apparatus leveled against them by J. Edgar Hoover. The question is, how were they able to do it? They were able to do it because they marshaled their resources, not just within the Black community, but they had people who came out of the woodworks to support, not just financially, but also through raising awareness. People who you would never suspect. The symbol of white beauty at that time was Jane Fonda. I
Mm.
don't know if any of these people are even old enough to even know who that is. Jane Fonda, believe it or not, funded the Panther 21 trial and organized all kind of fundraisers and spoke out against her own community
Mm.
for criminalizing, demonizing, and brutalizing the Panthers,
Mm.
right? So that's one example. And then let's go off continent and we go over to Asia. And me and you've talked about this example in the past. This is one of my favorite examples to talk about, which is with Gandhi, right? Because Gandhi literally set the stage for nonviolent tactics. He pretty much mastered those tactics when he was fighting the British. Okay. So when we look at the history that was going on back in 1930, he led the most iconic march, in my opinion, in history of nonviolence. He marched over 200 miles from his ashram in India to, the Indian Sea to make salt. And I know some people who are listening to this podcast may not even understand the relevance of what that means. So I'll say it very simply. In India at that time, salt was like air for us over here, right? It was that critical to their lives on how they made their food, how they prepared their meals, their medicines, almost everything depended on salt. And until the British came, salt was free. It was a free mineral resource. The British privatized the resource and they jailed any Indian who dared to make salt on their own. You had to buy British salt, right? So he led a march of 200, he went over 200 miles and he called for a complete shutdown of not just the government, but everything in the entire country. Over 100 million Indians participated in this march. And there was nobody killed in any mass violence or riots or demonstrations, et cetera, et cetera. He literally knew how to break the British government. And he was like, I'm going to break them economically. And I'm going to paralyze them from being able to function. And he knew he could do this because, he was quoted as saying that the British can't control millions of Indians without Indians participating.
Mm.
Right? So once again, these are strategies that are not based on emotion. They're not based on opinion. They're based on facts.
Mm.
British only had so many people. And at the time this was going on, what was the British doing? They were just recovering from World War I.
Mm.
So they didn't have the financial resources or the logistical resources to deal with this social and civil unrest that Gandhi was creating. And this is what led to the independence of India, right? So in both cases, we have the Panthers, which are totally fundamentally different in their approach and their ideology. But in both cases, when you look at the Panthers and you look at Gandhi, what they had in common is they used sound strategy to funnel their aggression against injustice. And that's what I think that's what we need to do as a community. And in both cases, Gandhi worked with people who were British, who were white, right? So there were white people at that ashram. They weren't just Indians. There were Muslims at that ashram. They weren't just Hindus, right? So he built a coalition, just like the Panthers built a coalition. When they say all power to the people, a lot of uneducated people who haven't studied the Panthers and definitely assume that just means the black people. The Panthers fought for power for all people, black people, white people. They told white people they should have white power. How ironic is that, right? So when we talk about moving forward, it's about taking the emotion out, taking the opinions out. Let's just put the facts on the table. And then let's allow ourselves to be open for 1 minute to question our own belief systems and our own biases.
I think I'm gonna leave it at that, brother. I think that was very well said. And ladies and gentlemen, this is Khufere Qhamata, my good friend, founder of Leap 72 Strategic Innovation Consultancy, co-founder of Academy M, which is a organization that focuses on empowering and training millennials. So someone who is very invested in not only the black community, but in the larger American community. So I'd like to thank you for your time, Q. And I hope to have you on again, brother.
Thank you, bro. You guys have a good one.
Awesome. Just stay on real quick.
All right.